Have you ever played a game that really made you feel? I think if you play video games even a tiny bit regularly, then you've experienced some sort of moment that has made you feel something that's stuck with you ever since. This is a universally shared experience from people who enjoy video games. And this video I found, called It's Just a Game, is a testament to that, showing many emotional moments from many games all in a row. You know, this video or the literally dozens of identical copies that people have also made. You know, classic YouTube stuff. But how do games achieve these sorts of things? Moments that make you feel stuff, whether it be happiness or sadness, awe or fear. How do games achieve these moments, and how do they stick out to us for so long? Well, today I want to find that out. Oh, and just in case you were wondering, quick spoiler warning for, all of these games, just so you've been warned. If you ask me, there are 3 keys to making these emotional payoffs work. The first one is a little bit broad. It's all about being cinematic. It's sort of hard to put your finger on what being cinematic truly means, but to me, this is all of the sorts of stuff that are synonymous with movies. The camera angles and the set design and the art style and all of that stuff that movies have been doing for the last 200 years. It's not unique to movies, video games also do all of these things, but it's something that the general person associates very heavily with the movie industry more so than the video game industry. I mean, the average person thinks every video game looks like this. So we're immediately at a disadvantage, to the point where people are saying games like these are more like movies than they are like games. And it's easy to see where they're coming from. Cinematic moments are generally what people gravitate towards when they try and think of epic, emotional, impactful moments that stick with them from games. And it's something that has become more and more catered towards by the AAA market as time has gone on. The God of War series, what started out as a hack and slash game about murder and destruction, has been reborn as a cinematic, story-driven franchise with more cutscene than game. And as you can imagine, they've mastered giving you the feels. They are visually stunning games with multi-billion-dollar budgets, and they have some of the best writers, actors, and animators in the industry, working tirelessly to give you a cinematic experience. And it just works. But to be cinematic doesn't mean you have to rely solely on cutscenes. Another excellent example of this is the final mission of Halo Reach. Lone Wolf. You watch the final evacuation ships leave the planet without you, and you get given a final objective: to survive. The mission goes on for as long as you can survive for, but the mission does not have a happy ending. When the Covenant finally kill you, you watch as the character you've been playing as for the entire story is taken down, after being left behind on the planet they were trying to protect. This moment isn't sold by cutscenes, but instead by gameplay. You have to actually fight for your survival, even though you know it's completely futile and that you can't win. But even when you do get to this final mission when you play the game, you know that there's no happy ending. You know that you can't actually win. You know full well that you have to die eventually. Yet if you ask most players, they'll tell you that they kept fighting anyway. You know you can't win. You know that you have to die eventually, but you try as hard as possible to keep the character alive because you care about them. And this is where good writing comes in. If the story wasn't as impactful or memorable, then this moment just wouldn't have worked. Because no matter how cool the concept is, if the player doesn't care about the character they're playing as, then the player doesn't care enough to keep fighting. And then the whole concept of the mission falls apart. Even if these cutscenes at the start and the end of the mission were left completely untouched, if the game had a badly written story, this mission just wouldn't have felt like an emotional climax at all. But thanks to the awesome scriptwriters at Bungie at the time, this actually works as one of the best and most memorable missions in all of the Halo games. And this is of course also true for pretty much every other good moment in any video game, because this sort of thing hinges on being able to relate to your characters and their relationships. If Master Chief and Cortana's relationship was lame and made no sense, then having this moment right here wouldn't have been something any player cared about or remembered. But even with no traditional cutscenes at all, you can still make a moment like this work. Look at Portal 1 for example. Valve games rarely take camera control away from the player. So even in a situation where the characters around you are all talking to each other and interacting just as if you were in a cutscene, you can still look around, which is why Gordon Freeman spends more time pissing about with a cactus in the corner than he does actually listening to anything the losers behind him have to say. But they still manage to make these excellent cinematic moments just by making the player actually want to look at the cool thing. And sometimes they even force you to look at it with the level design. In Portal 1, you spend the entire game being talked to by a disembodied voice. Eventually you escape the facility, but you're still being heckled by it the entire time. And at multiple points in the story, it tries to literally kill you. But eventually you find her chamber, and the big reveal of where this disembodied voice is coming from is just fantastic. And despite having complete control over your player character the entire time, you still get this cool cinematic reveal. No cutscenes required, because the door into her chamber forces this slow reveal whether the player likes it or not. And in Portal 2, they do a similar thing with this moment right here.
Hello, this is the part where I kill you.
What, did you think games don't use these sorts of things to be funny? Of course they do. This one is a lot more subtle though, because they're not using level design to force you to look at the exciting thing. They're instead sort of just nudging you to look in the right direction. But there's also this moment too.
Actually, why do we have to leave right now?
This is one I remember very vividly from when I was a kid. I was absolutely shook. Nowadays, the twist seems really obvious, but when I was 12, this had me quaking in my boots. This one does a lot of the things that the other ones I mentioned did, but a big part of this one is the music change. Going from this happy, victorious music to the minor key, bombastic orchestra as he starts laughing maniacally. Which leads me quite nicely onto the next key category. Music. Music sells pretty much every single good moment in any video game. Like literally every single one. And just to prove my point, just have a listen. If a game wants to make you feel happy, or sad, or scared, or like a killing machine, doesn't matter. Music is going to be a giant driving force in how that is achieved. If the game wants you to feel like an epic killing machine, then the music will be like this. If it wants you to feel terrified, then maybe the music will be like this. If the game wants you to feel a somber sort of emotion so strong that you literally can't describe it in words, then maybe it'll go... Music is everything to an impactful moment like this. A great example I love to point at is from Dark Souls 1. Every single boss theme in the entire game is crazy, bombastic orchestral music. It's menacing and intimidating and gives this feeling of fighting something greater than yourself. Because most of the time, you literally are fighting something greater than yourself. But the final boss of the game, the big bad, Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, the character the game has been building up to for the entire duration of its runtime, his music sounds like this. Just a piano and the sound of combat. It's absolutely beautiful. And the most recent Souls game created by From Software, Elden Ring, has another really cool thing to mention about music in video games. Because even the absence of music can sell an awesome moment in a game. Take a look at General Radahn. This boss fight has really cool boss music, fit for a boss as titanic as he is. But in the transition to his second phase, this is what happens. The music completely stops as he leaps into the sky, and then suddenly... He's falling from the sky?! There's also another fight in Elden Ring that does this exact same thing. In the fight against Dragon Lord Placidusax. He has an attack where he stabs a giant nuke into the floor, and every time he does it, the music just stops. There's also this moment in Outer Wilds' Echoes of the Eye. There's this house across the river emanating a sad yet ominous singing. But under the guise of darkness, you can sneak into this house undetected. But when you do, this is what happens. The silence is truly deafening, which only makes the sight you see at the top of the stairs all the more terrifying. Even in its absence, music can sell a moment better than any visual or line of dialogue ever could. And music can also be used to drum up that sweet, sweet nostalgia too. My favourite example of this that I remember so well is from Risk of Rain 2. Before Risk of Rain 2 was even a twinkle in Hopu's eye, I had already played a bunch of Risk of Rain 1. And that game's soundtrack is just as good as the sequel. And the music for the final stage of Risk of Rain 1 sounds like this. So when the official release update of Risk of Rain 2 came out, the update that added the final boss, I was in for a treat. The first time you arrive on the moon, Commencement, the final stage of the game, this is the music that the player will hear. And this gives me goosebumps to this day. And there's more of that sort of thing too. This is a song from Risk of Rain 1. And this is Mithrix's boss theme, the final boss of Risk of Rain 2. This is the boss theme for the final boss Providence from Risk of Rain 1. And this is the sound of Mithrix's second phase. This is called a leitmotif, and it's basically the reuse of certain melodies or rhythms to signify something narratively. Things can use leitmotifs to signify the presence of a character or a theme or something like that. And as Risk of Rain 2 points out, you can even do that across multiple games. And if you listen really closely, this happens in basically every game you've ever played. My favourite example of a leitmotif that I can think of is from a little game called Rainworld. And to be honest, this pushes the definition of leitmotif so far that I'm not sure if it even counts, but it's my video, so I can do whatever I want and I'm including it anyway. When you play Rainworld for the very first time, there's an opening cutscene, and this is the music that plays. And here's how that same song ends. This is the very first piece of music the player hears from the game. Fast forward dozens, if not hundreds of hours of playtime into the future, and you have a character called the Saint. The Saint is the final character, both chronologically in the story, as well as being the final character that the player will unlock. At the very end of the Saint's campaign, he swims up through the Void Sea, and this is the music that plays. This music is called The Cycle, and if you pay really close attention, you might notice that it sounds familiar. One of the very last pieces of music you hear in the entire game is also the same as the very first, just reversed and slightly pitched down. And the reason this is so fantastic is because Rainworld's story has very heavy themes of cycles and reincarnation, the world being on a loop where nobody can truly die. Everything is a cycle in Rainworld. So having the story be bookended by these two looping pieces of music is just absolutely beautiful. But I'm not quite done talking about Rainworld, because Rainworld has some fantastic examples of the final key to making these impactful moments work. And that is subverting your expectations. Let's look at the Saint again. He is the last character you unlock, his campaign is arguably the hardest, and his story takes place the furthest into the future chronologically. So when you are playing the Saint, you have probably played Rainworld for hundreds of hours, so you know the layout of the map very well by now, and you also know roughly where to go to get story stuff to happen. You go to Moon, and you go to 5 Pebbles. So for every other character in the game, you have probably taken this route at least once. You go up here through Chimney Canopy, and then you go right. This takes you towards this huge bridge. You make this jump, and you keep going right. Then you make it to the wall, which you then climb up, and you go say hello to your local neighborhood supercomputer. You will have likely done this as basically every character in the entire game. So when you play Saint, and you spawn relatively close to this part of Chimney Canopy, you probably just think to yourself, I'll just go right and go see 5 Pebbles, and then he'll tell me where to go. Oh. He just isn't here anymore. If you've never played Rainworld, this moment probably doesn't seem that significant to you. This moment only works because it preys upon your expectations. So if you've never played the game, this just seems super innocuous and boring. But when I first saw this, it blew my tiny little mind. A route to the wall has been here for every single other character in the entire game, and having it not be there is incredibly shocking. And because you've played all the other characters by now, and you've seen the shocking state of decay that this entire area has been in for a while now, just seeing this absence of an area tells you exactly what has happened. The last time you saw Pebbles, he looked like this, rotting away in a cage that he can't escape. And if you go to Shoreline and try and take the route to Shaded Citadel, a route that you've probably also taken as every other character in the game, you will see the aftermath of this collapse. So even if you didn't catch this shocking scenery change, you will have certainly caught this one. And the Saints campaign is full of these moments, full of moments that make your jaw drop to the floor, purely based off of taking your usual expectations and dashing them against the rocks. Without setting your expectations first, these moments don't even feel like moments at all, which is why significant pieces of scenery in your first playthrough of Rainworld don't ring any bells until long after you've completed the entire game. This is something a lot of games use to their advantage. Undertale does this quite well in the Genocide playthrough, and it functions on the exact same premise. The Genocide route is something that you can't really do by accident. You have to really try and get the Genocide ending, because you have to stand around waiting for enemies to spawn to kill them in every area of the game. Which of course means that if you are doing this, it's very likely that you've played the game a bunch of times and know a lot about it. So seeing all of these familiar moments go completely differently in the Genocide route has a big impact in a lot of the same ways. Even something super basic can have that effect too. Like when you've killed every enemy in an area, every combat pop-up will look like this. This sort of thing can work wonders, but it's also incredibly hard to pull off successfully. Something like this requires very careful planning, and it doesn't work if your players aren't committed to your story. My expectations can't be subverted when I had no expectations to begin with, but it doesn't actually have to be as big as these other examples where it subverts your expectations based on hundreds of hours of experience of the game and its mechanics. It can also be done with story writing, like how in Katana Zero, there's many references throughout the story to a swordsman named the Dragon, and you just assume that this nickname is for you, only for it to turn out that you're not the dragon. This guy is. And he's way cooler than you are. Or in Outer Wilds, where there are many texts where the Nomai talk about blowing up the sun to power the Ash Twin project. And at this point in the game, you've probably seen the sun blow up about 50 times by now. So this starts making you think that the goal of the game is to stop the sun blowing up and save the world. Only for it to turn out later in the game that the Nomai didn't blow up the sun at all. They tried, but it didn't work. And the sun has just reached the end of its natural life cycle, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. These moments are done with the game's writing, which I guess means it kind of falls under the cinematic approach that I mentioned at the start. But you know, that's actually kind of the point I want to make. These three categories are not separate from each other. They are linked. Most great moments you've seen in games contain more than one of these, and some of them contain all three. They cross over and overlap, and they're part of a greater whole. You know what? Here's a good example. Have you ever shown a friend a song from a video game soundtrack that you think is completely incredible, but when you show them it, they just think it's kind of meh? A big part of the reason for that is because without the context of the moment that song appears in, the music is less exciting. The music alone might be really good, but in context with all of these other incredible storytelling devices around it, it elevates it from being a good song to an incredible song. It just really goes to show that the way these things cross over is what makes these things work, not just each individual piece in isolation. If you ask me, the best game that exemplifies all of this crossover being so important is Outer Wilds. Outer Wilds, in my opinion, is the best game ever made. It's not for everyone, but for the people it's for, it's truly a masterpiece. And time again, it hits you with impactful moments that I will probably remember for the rest of my life. And because of the way the game works, with the core gameplay loop allowing you to sort of do whatever you want in whatever order, it makes some of these moments feel incredibly personal too. Let me tell you a quick story. When I first played Outer Wilds, it was late at night, and I decided to go inside of Dark Bramble, and I thought nothing of it. The rest of the game wasn't particularly scary, so I just went in there completely unaware of what was waiting for me. But it's super foggy inside of Dark Bramble, right? You can't see anything. So I used my probe, my little camera drone thing. I shot it in front of me to take pictures ahead of me in the fog. And as I took pictures from my drone flying ahead of me, I got a terrifying glimpse of nasty jaws and dead-looking eyes staring back at me. And I'll be honest, I absolutely lost my shit. And while I wasn't looking at my monitor, I could hear the monstrous roar of the fish as it ate my ship and sent me straight back to Timber Hearth. It was terrifying. But I absolutely loved every second of it. And it's the single most memorable moment I've ever encountered in any piece of media that I've ever consumed. And even on top of that, it's also very personal. Someone else flying into Dark Bramble might not have nearly as visceral of a reaction that I had. Maybe they're not as much of a baby as me, or maybe they didn't shoot their probe in front of them as they flew in. Or maybe they already knew about the existence of the fish before even entering the planet. But for me, it is the single most prominent memory I have of playing the game, and I swear that I will never forget it. And that moment contains all of these three things that I've been talking about. It's incredibly cinematic. The visuals of Outer Wilds are absolutely awe-inspiring. And Dark Bramble's claustrophobic fog with nothing but the dim lights penetrating through it is an incredibly well-crafted scene for these terrifying monsters to live in. The music inside of Dark Bramble also aids in this, being a haunting drone in the background as you're eaten alive. And if you use your signal scope, you can even hear the harmonica of feldspar being juxtaposed against the menacing environment, or even the distress signal of the escape pod ringing in your ears in the background. And this moment, of course, subverted my expectations. The entire rest of the game didn't have a single horror element in sight, so the idea that I was about to get jump scared by the toothy grin of a giant space fish was just not what I expected at all. And the cherry on top of all of that is that it's a moment that feels unique to me, like a story that I can tell about my adventures, rather than a shared experience that everyone who played the game also encountered. It's marvelous, and if more games were made like this, then the gaming industry would be a better place. So I guess what I'm trying to say is please go play Outer Wilds, like please go play it. It's literally the best game ever made.